The early 1990s in Nigeria carried a weight of transition. The country had just entered another turbulent phase under military rule, and the universities, scattered across the Federation, were both centers of hope and breeding grounds of violence. Among these institutions stood the University of Calabar, one of the most vibrant campuses in southern Nigeria, drawing students from different tribes and classes, each hoping to find a future in the chaos of an uncertain nation. In 1991, a guy named Benzema stepped onto the red earth of Calabar to begin his own journey. He was not like many of the other students who arrived in cars with parents and luggage. He came from a small, quiet village deep in Cross River State, a place where farming was the heartbeat of survival and education was considered a rare privilege. His parents had given him all they could, a bag of clothes, a few books, and their blessing. Poverty shadowed him, but so did determination. The University of Calabar was intimidating at first sight. The large entrance gate carried the weight of prestige, and the spread of faculty buildings, student hostels, and lecture halls stretched into a world far different from the humble paths of his village. For Benzema, everything was new. The loudness of student voices, the smell of kerosene stoves in the hostels, and the endless chatter about politics, music, and power. Like every new student, Benzema was assigned a room in the hostel. That night, carrying his bag on a weary shoulder, he entered the dimly lit room that would define the course of his life. Sitting on one of the bunks was a young man with a sharp face, broad shoulders, and an aura that carried unspoken authority. His name was Kaka. Kaka was not just any student. He was already a name that echoed in whispers across campus. Unknown to Benzema at that moment, Kaka was the number one of the Black Axe Confraternity at the University of Calabar. He had joined years earlier, climbing swiftly through the ranks with fearlessness and cunning. While most saw him as another hostile mate, the underground world of cultism respected him as a leader. The first conversation between Benzema and Kaka was ordinary. They talked about where they came from, their courses, and how difficult life in the hostel could be. Yet from that night, Kaka saw something in Benzema, a quiet fire, a hunger that could be shaped. For Benzema, the attraction to Kaka was not immediate. He admired his confidence, his way of commanding respect, and his ability to navigate campus politics. But as the weeks passed, he began to notice how Kaka moved with a group of men, all dressed sharply, carrying themselves with unshakable pride. They were feared, respected, and untouchable. By mid-semester, Benzema was no longer the shy village boy. He had seen enough of campus life to know that survival required more than just attending lectures. The cult groups controlled the balance of fear and power in the university. To many, they represented danger. To others, they were protection. To Benzema, they began to look like the path out of invisibility. It was Kaka who eventually opened the door. One evening, as students gathered outside the hostel to discuss campus politics, Kaka spoke to Benzema in a low tone that carried both warning and invitation. Life here is not for the weak. If you want to stand, you must walk with those who hold the ground. Benzema listened carefully. He understood the unspoken words. The path ahead would be dangerous, but it was also the first time he felt the possibility of belonging. For a boy who had grown up in poverty, the chance to be seen, respected, and feared was intoxicating. Weeks later, under the dark veil of night, Benzema was led by Kaka and others into a forested area near the outskirts of campus. That night, the initiation rites of the Black Axe sealed his fate. The pain, the chants, the blood oaths, all became part of his new identity. By the time dawn returned, Benzema was no longer just a freshman from a small village. He was now a member of the Black Axe, bound by loyalty, secrecy, and violence. Kaka welcomed him fully, smiling with pride as if he had planted a seed. For Benzema, it was both a rebirth and a surrender. He had stepped into a brotherhood that promised power, but also demanded blood. The year 1991 marked the beginning of a journey that would one day end in tragedy. By the second semester of his first year, Benzema's life at the University of Calabar had transformed in ways he could never have imagined. The shy boy from the village was gone. In his place stood a young man learning the codes of secrecy, loyalty, and fear. The Black Axe had already begun to shape his identity. Campus life in 1991 was a mixture of brilliance and chaos. By day, the university buzzed with lectures, debates, and political rallies. By night, the hostels turned into arenas of power where groups of young men marked territories, settled scores, and silently recruited. For ordinary students, survival meant minding their own business. But for Benzema, survival now meant living by the oath of the axe. Kaka, his roommate and mentor, wasted no time in teaching him the ropes. He introduced Benzema to the language of the Brotherhood, words and symbols outsiders could never understand. He showed him how to recognize fellow members in a crowd without speaking, how to move with confidence even when fear threatened to choke the chest, and how loyalty meant obeying orders without question. Under Kaka's shadow, Benzema gained access to spaces most freshmen never saw. He attended clandestine meetings in abandoned lecture halls where senior members debated strategies for power. He sat quietly as Kaka and other leaders planned how to control student elections, manipulate hostile politics, and maintain dominance over rival confraternities. The first time Benzema saw violence linked to cultism was a night he would never forget. A dispute had broken out between members of the Black Axe and the Vikings over control of a party on campus. Kaka, as the number one, led the retaliation. Benzema followed, his heart pounding as he watched boys armed with machetes and axes chase their rivals into the darkness. Benzema did not fight that night, but he saw blood for the first time. He saw the fear in the eyes of their enemies, and he felt the rush of power that came with belonging to something feared. It was intoxicating, terrifying, and unforgettable. The next morning, campus was quiet, as though nothing had happened. Officially, the university never acknowledged the violence. Unofficially, everyone knew who ruled the hostels. Benzema understood then that the Black Axe was not just a group, it was a shadow government within the campus, a force that even lecturers hesitated to challenge. Kaka noticed the change in him. The once timid freshman had begun to carry himself with confidence. He no longer walked alone. There was always a small group of fellow initiates around him, laughing loudly, commanding respect. The axe was teaching him how to live like a man who feared nothing. But Kaka also gave him warnings. One evening, sitting on their bunks in the dim light of the hostel, he leaned closer and said, "Never forget, Benzema, this path does not forgive weakness. It gives you power, but it can also take your life. If you want to stand, stand fully. Half loyalty will bury you." The words sank deep. For Benzema, there was no turning back. He had tasted the Brotherhood's power, and he wanted more. As weeks turned into months, Benzema began carrying out small assignments for the group, delivering messages, shadowing rival members, guarding their leaders during tense gatherings. He was proving himself, and the seniors noticed. His intelligence, calmness, and loyalty stood out. Unlike some initiates who were reckless and loud, Benzema learned quickly to move with quiet strength. Meanwhile, Kaka's reputation grew darker. As number one, he was at the center of every violent clash, every decision that involved blood. Enemies plotted against him, and lecturers whispered about his name. But within the Black Axe, his word was law. Benzema watched closely, learning not just how to fight, but how to lead. By the end of his 100 level, Benzema was no longer seen as just a recruit. He was rising, slowly but surely, through the ranks of the Axe. And though he still carried the poverty of his past, he now walked like a man who owned a piece of the future. The university around him was changing too. Other confraternities, Vikings, Buccaneers, clansmen, were growing stronger, each seeking dominance. Conflict was brewing like a storm in the distance. Benzema did not know it yet, But the decisions he made during these early years would place him at the center of that storm. By his second year in the University of Calabar, Benzema had already become a name that carried weight within his circles. What had begun as a nervous initiation in the shadows of the campus forest was now shaping into a full identity. He was no longer a boy finding his place. He was a man being prepared for leadership. The early 1990s were violent years in Nigerian universities. Cult groups were not only expanding in numbers but also in influence. They infiltrated student union elections, influenced hostel administration, and often dictated who could host events on campus. The rivalry among groups, Black Axe, Vikings, Buccaneers, Klansmen, was no longer subtle. Tension was always bubbling beneath the surface, and sometimes it erupted into full-blown wars. For Benzema, 200 level marked his transition from observer to participant. Kaka, still the number one, often took him along to high-level meetings. He was exposed to strategy, how the Black Axe ensured dominance by controlling fear, how they created networks outside the university with alumni who had graduated but still pulled strings, and how they prepared for inevitable clashes with rivals. One incident defined Benzema's second year. It began as a small dispute at a student social gathering, but within hours, it escalated into a violent confrontation between the Black Axe and the Vikings. The Vikings, known for their ruthlessness, had gained more recruits that year and were challenging the Black Axe's dominance. The clash was brutal. It happened at night near the Faculty of Arts quadrangle. Bottles shattered, machetes flashed in the moonlight, and shouts echoed into the hostels. Benzema, holding a short dagger given to him by Kaka, stood in the chaos for the first time not as a watcher but as a fighter. Fear gripped him at first, but then training and loyalty took over. He moved with the group, defending, attacking when commanded. Blood was spilled on both sides. By dawn, the university was tense with silence. Officially, the authorities condemned student unrest, but everyone on campus knew what had happened. The Black Axe had held their ground, but the Vikings had made it clear they were not afraid. For Benzema, that night marked his baptism into real conflict. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. He felt both the weight of it and the thrill of it. Something in him hardened. He understood now that the path he had chosen was paved with blood. Kaka praised him privately afterward. "You did well," he said, his eyes sharp with approval. "You did not freeze. That is the heart we need." From then, Benzema's status within the Confraternity rose quickly. He was trusted with more responsibilities, handling meetings, organizing recruits, and enforcing discipline within the ranks. He learned how to command respect, not by shouting, but by carrying himself with calm authority. His intelligence and ability to remain composed in crises made him stand out. Meanwhile, campus life carried on in its strange duality. By day, students laughed in lecture halls, chased assignments, and danced at concerts. By night, the hostels whispered with fear. Names of confraternity leaders were passed around in hushed tones. Benzema's name was not yet known publicly like Kaka's, but within the underground, he was already being recognized as one of the next strong men of the Black Axe. It was during this time that Kaka began to show cracks. His life had become consumed by violence and paranoia. He skipped classes frequently, preferring to spend nights in off-campus safe houses. Enemies surrounded him, and even among his own men, whispers of discontent grew. For Benzema, this was another lesson. Leadership in cultism was not just about power, it was about survival. By the end of his 200 level, Benzema was no longer just a recruit. He was a lieutenant, a rising force within the Black Axe, and one whose path seemed destined for the highest seat. But in the shadows, the Vikings were also rising. Their eyes had noticed Benzema. They marked him not just as another member, but as one who might one day lead, and therefore one who would one day have to be eliminated. By 1993, The University of Calabar was in a state of simmering tension. Conflict between confraternities was becoming more frequent, and the administration was struggling to contain it. Students whispered about names that carried both respect and fear, and at the top of those whispers was Kaka, the number one of the Black Axe. But the very power that made Kaka untouchable was also destroying him. The life of a campus cult leader was a constant war, a war with rivals, a war with authorities, and even a conflict with one's own conscience. Kaka had grown restless. His studies had become almost non-existent. The nights of meetings, confrontations, and reprisals had swallowed his days, leaving little space for lectures or exams. By now, Kaka's face was known not just within the university, but also to security operatives in Calabar town. The police had begun watching him, though rarely did they interfere directly in campus cultism unless blood spilled beyond the gates. Within the Black Axe, Kaka remained respected, but his grip was slipping. He trusted fewer people, feared betrayal from within, and began relying heavily on intimidation to maintain control. To some, he had become reckless. To others, he was a living legend walking on borrowed time. Benzema, now in his third year, stood at Kaka's side through it all. He had grown from a timid recruit to a trusted lieutenant. He was calm where Kaka was volatile, strategic where Kaka was impulsive. Many younger members began to look up to Benzema, seeing in him a future leader who might steady the Brotherhood when Kaka's reign inevitably ended. The beginning of Kaka's fall came during a violent confrontation with the Vikings in 1993. It was one of the bloodiest clashes the University of Calabar had seen that decade. The Vikings had ambushed a group of Black Axe men at a student party, leaving 2 badly injured. Kaka retaliated swiftly, leading a night raid into a Vikings-controlled hostel. The battle that followed shook the campus. Machetes and axes were used. Blood stained the stairways, and students who were not involved locked themselves inside their rooms, trembling as screams echoed through the night. The fight ended without a clear victor, but it left Kaka deeply exposed. The university authorities cracked down, and his name was at the center of the reports. Suddenly, the number one of the Black Axe was no longer just feared, he was hunted. After weeks of hiding, skipping lectures, and dodging both rivals and authorities, Kaka made the decision that stunned many. He dropped out of the University of Calabar. For someone who had once ruled the campus with an iron fist, it was a bitter retreat. But he knew the walls were closing in, and survival was more important than pride. For Benzema, Kaka's exit was both a loss and an opportunity. The man who had introduced him into the Brotherhood was gone, but in his absence, a vacuum emerged. Senior members debated who would rise next. Some favored older initiates, men who had been in the system longer. But more and more eyes turned toward Benzema, the calm and calculating lieutenant who had proven himself in fights, in planning, and in loyalty. Benzema did not lobby for the role. He did not need to. His actions spoke for him. In meetings, he commanded respect with quiet authority. In confrontations, he never wavered. And unlike many, he still managed to balance his studies, showing that he was disciplined as well as fearless. The younger recruits rallied around him. The seniors respected him. Slowly but surely, the path toward leadership opened before him. By the time Kaka disappeared from campus life completely, Benzema had already begun to act like the new center of gravity for the Black Axe. The Brotherhood had lost one number one, but in the shadows of Calabar, another was being prepared. When Kaka left the University of Calabar in disgrace and fear, the campus atmosphere shifted. 4 years, his name had been the sound of dominance. Now, the throne was empty. Rival confraternities sensed weakness, waiting to strike. Within the Black Axe, the question was clear: who would step into the vacuum? At first, several older members tried to claim leadership. They argued that their years in the movement gave them seniority. But leadership within the Black Axe was never about age alone. It was about charisma, courage, and respect. And Benzema had already built a reputation that overshadowed many of his seniors. Meetings were held in secret, in classrooms at night and in off-campus hideouts. Benzema, though still a student trying to balance academics, was at the center of these discussions. He never pushed himself forward openly, but when he spoke, others listened. His words carried the weight of strategy, and his calm presence reassured even the most restless members. The turning point came after another violent clash with the Vikings. This time, it was Benzema who led. The Vikings had attacked 2 Black Axe men near the school's library. Retaliation was expected, but there was no number one to command it. All eyes turned to Benzema. That night, he gathered his men, planned their movement with precision, and struck with calculated force. The attack was brutal, but unlike Kaka's reckless raids, it was organized. They injured their enemies, sent a message of dominance, and withdrew before the police could respond. By dawn, the story spread across campus. The Black Axe had a new leader in spirit, even if not yet in title. Within weeks, the inevitable happened. The elders of the movement, both on campus and outside, gave their blessing. In whispered ceremonies and secret gatherings, Benzema was crowned number 1 of the Black Axe at the University of Calabar. For Benzema, it was both a triumph and a burden. From a poor boy in the village, he had risen to the most feared position in one of the most powerful confraternities in Nigeria. But leadership meant living with a target on his back. Every rival group now saw him as the enemy. Every mistake could be fatal. Benzema took the role with the seriousness it demanded. He reorganized the group, enforcing discipline, cutting down on reckless behavior, and ensuring that the Black Axe men moved with unity. Under his leadership, the Black Axe grew even stronger. Recruitment increased, their control over campus politics deepened, and their reputation spread beyond Calabar. But the more powerful they became, the more dangerous the game grew. The Vikings, in particular, felt the challenge. Their clashes with the Black Axe escalated, and every confrontation left both sides more determined to destroy the other. For Benzema personally, the weight of leadership was immense. He was admired, feared, and respected, but he also carried the loneliness of power. He had seen what leadership did to Kaka, and he knew his own fate might not be different. Still, he accepted it. To him, the brotherhood was no longer just protection or prestige, it was his destiny. By 1995, Benzema was at the height of his power. He balanced his academics enough to keep himself afloat, but his true energy was in leading the Black Axe. His name was no longer whispered only in the hostels. It was spoken in lectures, cafeterias, and even outside the gates. Students who had never met him still feared him. Lecturers knew not to cross him. The boy from the village had become a strong man in the shadows. But strong men in the shadows rarely retire peacefully. By 1995, Benzema's reign as number 1 of the Black Axe at the University of Calabar was firmly established. What had begun in secrecy years earlier had now become the defining chapter of his life. He was no longer the quiet boy introduced by Kaka. He was the face of a movement, the one students whispered about whenever conflict erupted, the one whose presence could silence a room. Under his leadership, the Black Axe expanded its influence across campus. They controlled student politics, ensuring their candidates won key positions in the student union government. They dictated which student groups could organize events, and even lecturers avoided confrontation with them. Fear and respect became their currency, and Benzema was the banker. Unlike Kaka, whose rule had been marked by recklessness, Benzema ruled with calculation. He insisted on structure. Meetings were planned, actions carefully considered, and discipline enforced. To many in the Brotherhood, he was the leader who brought stability. To outsiders, he was the silent storm that could strike at any moment. But with power came enemies. The Vikings' Confraternity had not forgotten their clashes with the Black Axe. Every victory for Benzema felt like humiliation for them. Their numbers were growing, and their desire for revenge was deepening. In his third and final year, Benzema began to notice signs of growing hostility. Vikings members followed him from a distance, shadows lingered near his hostel, and information reached him that his name was being mentioned in their secret meetings. He knew they were planning something, but he could not predict when or how it would come. Still, he did not relent. His focus was on leaving a legacy within the Brotherhood. He mentored younger members, teaching them the codes, reminding them of loyalty, and ensuring the structure of the Black Axe would survive even if he did not. To his followers, Benzema was not just a leader. He was a figure of strength and destiny. Yet, cracks began to show in his personal life. Balancing academics with the life of a cult leader was nearly impossible. He often missed lectures, spent nights in safe houses, and carried the weight of fear with him everywhere he went. His family back in the village had no idea of the life he was living. To them, he was just their son, struggling to graduate. The final semester carried an uneasy silence. Students spoke of an impending clash. The Vikings had been humiliated one too many times, and whispers suggested they were preparing something drastic. Benzema moved with more caution, but he also refused to hide. To him, fear was weakness, and weakness was betrayal. He was at the peak of his reign, but in the shadows, death was already waiting. The following year was Benzema's final semester at the University of Calabar. He was weeks away from completing his degree, yet every day carried the weight of uncertainty. His name had become legend on campus, whispered in awe and fear, but legends also attracted enemies. The Vikings' Confraternity had been patient. For years they had suffered defeats, watched their influence shrink, and endured humiliation at the hands of the Black Axe. To them, Benzema's reign was the greatest insult. His name was a shadow cast over their pride, and they had sworn that before he graduated, he would not leave the campus alive. Benzema knew it too. The warnings had reached him. Friends whispered that he should lay low, avoid night movements, or even leave Calabar until after graduation. But for Benzema, that was unthinkable. To vanish in fear would be to betray everything he had built. He carried himself with the same confidence that had made him number one, even though he knew the ground beneath his feet was shifting. One humid evening in late April, the storm finally broke. Benzema had attended a small meeting with close allies of the Black Axe, reviewing plans for ensuring younger members took over leadership after his departure. It was his attempt to secure the legacy of his reign. As the meeting ended, he left the secluded hostel block, walking alone toward the main campus road. The night air was thick, the distant hum of generators mixing with the chirp of crickets. That was when they struck. From the shadows, a group of Vikings emerged. They had been waiting, tracking his movements. Machetes glistened under the dim glow of streetlights, and weapons were raised with deadly intent. There was no warning, no exchange of words, just the brutal rush of vengeance. Benzema fought back, as expected of a man who had lived through countless clashes. He threw punches, dodged strikes, and in those few seconds, his legend grew even larger. But numbers overwhelmed him. A shotgun blast echoed across the night, scattering nearby students into panic. Screams filled the air. When the dust settled, Benzema lay on the ground, blood staining the earth. His reign, his story, and his dreams ended not with graduation, but with execution. The Vikings had claimed their revenge. Word spread like wildfire across the University of Calabar. Students awoke to the news with disbelief. Hostels buzzed with fear. The Black Axe was thrown into chaos, their leader gone. Tension exploded into the open, as clashes between the two cults erupted across campus in the days that followed. The streets of Calabar felt the tremors of his death, and the university descended into a dark season of fear. Benzema's body was later taken back to his village, where his family wept without ever fully knowing the life he had lived on campus. To them, he was their son who had struggled, fought, and nearly made it out of poverty. To the University of Calabar, he was both a strong man and a cautionary tale. And to the Vikings, he was their final trophy. The morning after Benzema's execution, the University of Calabar was unrecognizable. Fear clung to the air like a heavy fog. Students whispered in corridors, too afraid to speak loudly, yet unable to stay silent. News of his demise spread faster than the morning sun, carried on trembling voices and panicked rumors. The body of Benzema, the once dominant number one of the Black Axe, was gone from campus, but the imprint of his fall remained. Blood stains on the ground near the hostel block became a grim landmark, a reminder of how fragile even the most feared man could be when targeted by fate and enemies. The Black Axe members were enraged. To them, the execution was not just an attack on one man. It was an attack on their brotherhood, their dominance, their pride. In emergency meetings held in hidden corners of the campus, voices rose in anger, pledging swift revenge. Younger members wept openly, while older ones swore blood oaths to retaliate. Benzema's demise had become a rallying cry. The Vikings, on the other hand, walked with renewed confidence. 4 years, they had suffered under the shadow of Benzema's reign, but now the tables had turned. The execution was not just revenge, it was a declaration of power. Their members celebrated quietly, emboldened by the strike that had shattered their greatest rival. Students who were unaffiliated with either confraternity lived in terror. The university campus turned into a battlefield without warning. At night, clashes broke out between groups of Black Axe men and Vikings, machetes flashing under the moonlight. Shots rang out sporadically, sending waves of panic across hostels. No one felt safe, and lectures were often abandoned as fear spread through the student body. The university authorities were helpless. Cultism was not new to them, but the execution of a reigning number one in broad daylight, or what students considered daylight, even under street lamps, was unprecedented. The administration threatened expulsion, police patrols were introduced, but everyone knew these measures were paper shields against the storm that had already been unleashed. In Benzema's village, news of his demise hit like a lightning strike. His family, unaware of his deep involvement in cult activities, received his body with shock and grief. To them, he had been a son struggling to lift them out of poverty. They mourned a young man who had been their hope, without fully knowing the double life he had lived in Calabar. His burial was quiet, marked by wails of women and the silence of men who could not understand why his life had ended so violently. Back on campus, his name lingered. For the Black Axe, Benzema became a martyr. Stories of his bravery on the night of his demise were retold in hushed tones, his resistance against overwhelming odds becoming part of their oral history. For the Vikings, he remained proof that no man, no matter how powerful, was untouchable. For ordinary students, his story became a cautionary tale, a warning of how cultism consumed even the brightest futures. The violence his demise sparked would last months, staining the reputation of the University of Calabar for years to come. The demise of Benzema was not the end. It was the spark that set the University of Calabar ablaze. In the days immediately following his execution, the Black Axe Confraternity moved with fury. Meetings stretched late into the night, candles burning low in darkened rooms as younger members looked to their elders for direction. For them, Benzema was not just a leader who had fallen. He was a martyr, a symbol that demanded blood for blood. Revenge was swift. Within a week, 2 Vikings members were cornered near the Faculty of Arts. Armed with machetes, Black Axe men struck without hesitation. The executions were brutal, leaving no doubt about who was responsible. The campus shuddered as news of the retaliation spread. The Vikings, however, were not intimidated. They had slain the number one of the Black Axe. To them, nothing could be more empowering. Each attack by the Black Axe was met with an equal, if not greater, response. Hostel blocks became danger zones, lecture attendance dwindled, and every night echoed with screams. The university administration struggled to maintain control. Extra patrols of policemen were stationed at gates and around key areas, but the confraternities adapted quickly. Clashes moved off campus, spilling into dark alleys of Calabar City, where machetes and bullets left trails of blood. Ordinary students lived like prisoners in their own hostels. Some left campus altogether, fearing they would be caught in the crossfire. Rumors filled the air, names of suspected cultists were whispered in fear, and even lecturers were wary of confronting students who carried the invisible power of secret societies. For the Black Axe, every move carried the memory of Benzema. Younger members wore his name like armor, vowing to live and die by his legacy. His face appeared in graffiti scrawled on hostel walls, his story retold in songs sung during initiation ceremonies. He had become larger in death than he had been in life. For the Vikings, his demise was proof that legends could fall. Their ranks swelled as new recruits, emboldened by the execution, sought to join their fold. They walked with heads high, machetes hidden beneath coats, always ready for another strike. In the 90s, the University of Calabar had become a war zone. Police raided hostels, dragging out suspected cultists, but few were ever charged. The system was too weak, too compromised. It was a season of fear that marked an entire generation of students. Those who were there still speak of it decades later. The reign of Benzema, his bloody end, and the conflict that followed. Years passed, but the name Benzema never left the walls of the University of Calabar. His reign as number one of the Black Axe and his execution at the hands of the Vikings became part of the whispered history of the campus, a tale told in hostels, initiation rites, and cautionary lectures. By the late 1990s, cultism in Nigerian universities had taken on new dimensions. The demise of a figure like Benzema proved two truths: power could be seized, and power could also be destroyed. Both the Black Axe and the Vikings drew lessons from his story, though in opposite directions. For the Black Axe, Benzema's life symbolized loyalty and leadership. He had risen from a poor boy in a Calabar village to the number one of the most feared confraternities. His determination, charisma, and resilience were admired, and his violent demise only immortalized him further. New initiates were told of his bravery on the night of his execution, how he fought against overwhelming odds before falling. His name became a password of sorts, invoked when loyalty was demanded, remembered when sacrifices were made. For the Vikings, his demise was their greatest victory. To have executed the number one of the axe was to cement their place in confraternity history. His fall was proof of their strength, and they carried that confidence into future clashes. Songs and chants in their gatherings referenced to the 90s, the year they claimed the life of the Black Axe's number one. For ordinary students and the wider university community, however, Benzema's story was a scar. His rise had shown how easily young men, especially those from poor backgrounds, could be drawn into cultism with promises of power and protection. His fall revealed the futility of such power, how quickly it could be snatched away by violence. Parents warned their children with his story, lecturers recalled his reign with bitterness, and survivors of that bloody season spoke of him as a ghost who never left the campus. In the years that followed, the Nigerian government launched stronger crackdowns on cultism. Universities tried to root out confraternities, police conducted raids, and politicians debated the growing crisis. But the seeds had already been planted. Stories like Benzema's continued to inspire young men seeking identity and power, even as they served as warnings to others. Back in his village, Benzema's family carried the grief silently. His parents never fully knew the extent of his life in Calabar, only that he had gone to school with dreams of lifting them from poverty and returned in a coffin. To them, he was not a number one or a cult leader. He was their son, a boy who had wanted more from life than the village could give. And so Benzema's story lived in two worlds. In the university, he was a legend of cultism, a name etched in blood and memory. In the village, he was just a child lost too soon. Even now, decades later, his name lingers in the corners of Calabar. It lives in the quiet fear of old alumni, in the bold chants of cult initiates, and in the silent prayers of parents sending their children to school. Benzema's life was short, his reign fierce, and his end brutal. But his legacy, for better or worse, became part of the unspoken history of Nigerian universities. This content is for educational purposes only. Tell us your thoughts about this story.